Welcome to this presentation that I've entitled Corinth in Paul's Time. Our historical hermeneutical element is intended to place the letters in a particular historical context. And we can do that well for the Corinthian letters because there are lots of ways in which our knowledge of the geography and the history is connected with the interpretation of the letters. But before we go any further, let's look at that title, Corinth in Paul's Time. It's important to distinguish two different periods in Corinth's history. There was an earlier period in which Corinth was referred to often as wealthy Corinth. But Corinth, because it sided against the Romans, was destroyed in a very significant way by the Roman general Mummius in the year 146. And so the city then lay, not completely abandoned, but fairly quiet for about 100 years. And then it was rebuilt under Julius Caesar, but he was quickly assassinated. But then his adopted nephew, Caesar Augustus, paid for and fulfilled, therefore, Julius Caesar's promise to rebuild Corinth. So as a result, Corinth has these two different lives. It has an earlier period prior to, again, 146 BC, and then it has a later period after 44 BC. And the first period is often called wealthy Corinth, and the later period is called Roman Corinth. And so obviously for understanding Paul and the Corinth that existed during Paul's day, we're interested in that second city called typically Roman Corinth. And I stress this because when we hear information about Corinth, sometimes these things are confused. In other words, some commentators cite information that's from a much earlier period and really is only true of that earlier city called wealthy Corinth and wasn't true of Paul's day. And so we have to be careful when we use our sources about understanding the city and the historical context that it does indeed come from that Roman city of Corinth, or as I've entitled, the Corinth that existed in Paul's day. Well, you may know that Paul founded the city of Corinth on his second missionary journey. He went there and stayed there for a year and a half. And you can see on the map then where Corinth is located. It's in the southern part of Greece, and it's located in a very strategic location in that area called the Peloponnesus. Here's a good slide to show you the strategic location of Corinth. You can see that it's located right where the lower, it's almost like an island, the isthmus is located, the Peloponnesus, and it's connected to the mainland of Corinth by a very narrow strip of land. And Corinth was situated at a place where it had therefore two harbors. It had one on the west called Lycaeum, and it had another one on the east called Cenchrea. And it was advantageous for ships, rather than sailing all around the bottom of the Peloponnesus, to actually take their boat to the one port of Corinth, and then if it were a small boat, they'd put it on a track and they'd haul it across to the other side with oxen. Or if it were too large, they would unload the goods, transport it to the other side on the other port, Cenchrea, and then set sail from there. And that was advantageous for two reasons. First, it was a lot shorter. You can see that to go around the bottom of the Peloponnesus involved an extra 185 nautical miles. And even a second, bigger reason is that south area was especially dangerous for sailing. You can see there the heading Cape Malay. And the winds, still today, and the currents are really treacherous. In fact, in the ancient world, the sailors had a saying, when you double Cape Malay, say goodbye to your home. In other words, when you double it, when you go by the second time, you're pressing your luck. You might be able to sail safely around it one time, but a double time, a second time, you might as well kiss your home goodbye because you're never ever going to make it. And again, still today, cruise ships often run into rough seas during that southern part. And so it was of great advantage, instead of going all the way around the bottom, to go instead through what's called the Gulf of Corinth, land on the one port, and then take the boat or the goods to the other side, or reverse the direction, depending on which direction you were going. And the importance for Corinth is this. Corinth is located right there. It gets to control and tax all of these goods coming and going. And so that's one reason why Corinth is in such a strategic location. Here's a nice close-up where you can see how narrow that piece of land is. It's only about 4 miles across. So the whole of the Peloponnesus, which is almost half of the entire world of Greek, it was the ancient province of Achaia, different than the province of Macedonia to the north. We treat Greece all as one country, but Macedonia to the north was a different people group, different customs and habits than Achaia, southern Greece. And the Peloponnesus is joined then by this narrow 4-mile strip of land, and you can see here on the map the two ports that we've been talking about, Lechaon, the closer one to the west, and Kenkrea, a little further distance to the east. Here's a nice satellite picture. It's a bit distorted because of the wide angle, but even here you can see the two seas, how close they are connected to each other. Here's another shot. You can see the Acro Corinth. We're going to talk about that in a second. Acro Corinth meaning the High Corinth. It's the huge acropolis around which the city is centered. It's located right there. And at the foot of the Acro Corinth, that's where the ancient city was located. You can see now there's a modern city. That's because there was a significant earthquake in the late 1800s. And so the city moved from its base of the Acro Corinth for defensive and other purposes, and now they wanted to live by the sea. And that's good news for us today because that left the site, the ancient site, relatively free to be excavated. And so we know a lot about the ancient city of Corinth because it was largely abandoned in modern times. But you can see again the flat plain, the 4 miles connecting the two seas, and Corinth is located right on the side controlling this key landmass. Here's the Aqua Corinth that we've been talking about. You get a sense of how dramatic it is. And again, that's the highest and the closest rocky point. And so if you control the Aqua Corinth, there's no way that an army can come either north or south into the Peloponnesus without passing by you in Corinth. From this view, we've actually on top of the Acro Corinth, and so now we're looking the other direction. And again, despite the wide angle, you can see how close the two seas are. The Gulf of Corinth on the left, and the Aegean Sea on the right, and the 4 miles connecting. And you have a sense, even in this picture too, of the fertility of the land. So Corinth is successful because of its strategic location, controlling commercial traffic, because of its strategic location, controlling armies coming in or out of the Peloponnesus. And now here's an added feature, the fertility of the land. Still today, it's a very productive area. Here's a slide of the Diol Coast. What's the Diol Coast? The Diol Coast is, in Greek, that which is hauled over or through. And this is that road on which ships would be carted from the one side to the other. And the remnants of that road, that track, that Diol Coast, are still seen today. You can see there's a canal. That's a modern addition. We'll talk about that in a second. But there's the ancient road dating well back before Paul's time. Here's even a better preserved part of that road, and it's sad that actually it's undergone some damage. It hasn't been well preserved in recent times. Here's a nice map of, you can see it's not complete straight line. You can see the path of the Diol Coast and the modern canal that was built right through it. Now, some scholars have doubted whether it was possible for ships to be carried from one side to the other, and so it's important to recognize that there are at least 5 recordings in ancient writings about how that happened. The reason there aren't more, though, is because it was such a common experience. Today, too, it's unlikely to find someone saying, there were cars driving down the Beltline. The Beltline is a big city right here by Calvin Seminary, because it was such a common experience. And so the references are more to armies, because they were in a hurry. Instead of sailing around the whole Peloponnesus, they put their boat in one side and they carried them across to the other side. So these texts are important for showing that it was possible. And, this quote from Aristophanes is kind of interesting. Aristophanes has this play, and you have to realize that in plays there are no female actors. Anyway, in this play we have a person who's supposed to be a woman but it's a comedy. And it's clear to the audience that the woman is not really a woman, it's a man. He's a man dressed in woman's clothes. And the reason they know that is not only from other events, but he has a phallus. He has the male sex organ. It's an artificial instrument kind of sticking out of his dress. And so the other character says, he's kind of wondering about him. And so the actor, in this case, takes this phallus and kind of pushes it between his legs to the back so it's hidden, and then the person goes on the other side and it goes back, and so everyone's laughing in the audience as this scene goes back and forth. But then the person makes a comment which is related to the Corinthian canal. The speaker says, "You have a sort of isthmus, brother," right? "Hauling your ship back and forth more often than the Corinthians." And the only way that people would know what the speaker, the actor, is talking about, the only reason they would get the joke, is if they knew that ships regularly went back and forth, right, across this peninsula in the Corinthians. And then the speaker can take advantage of that in making a joke about what was happening in the play. Well, in any case, the ultimate relevance is to show that the back and forth of ships crossing was possible in the ancient world. We have 5 literary sources that say that were, and we have this play from Aristophanes, which is only funny, and it only works if it's a widespread, knowable thing. And so again, Corinth is successful because it's taxing and controlling a very lucrative business of shipping back and forth across the peninsula. Here's some more pictures from the remnants of the Diol Coast. And there's a 1960 versus a 2006. So you can see how well preserved it was in 1960 and the current state of affairs today. So it's kind of sad that it hasn't been better preserved. Greece, is, as you know, not going through very strong times financially, and they don't have the resources to support such excavations. Just for your interest, the idea of cutting a canal goes way back. So already well before Paul's day, there is evidence that kings and different people had the idea of digging a canal so that these two waters could be connected. Nero was the first person to actually try it. He took 6,000 slaves from the Jewish revolt. Remember the Jewish revolt from 66 to 70? This is right before Nero committed suicide. He took 6,000 of them and used them as slaves, and they can still see the cuttings on both ends where they started, but they had to abandon the project because it was just too much. And we should be sympathetic why it was too much, because it wasn't until about the 1880s where a French engineering company, I'm going to skip that slide, took about 12 years to dig through this thing. And you can see here how steep and how difficult it was to cut through and to create a canal. Today you can do bungee jumping actually from the bridge. It's a kind of a scary sight because it is so high up. So again, the canal is a visible reminder of how tempting it was and how advantageous it was to somehow connect these bodies of water rather than sail around the bottom of the Peloponnesus, longer distance and much more dangerous. Here's a ship. The canal was built in the 1880s, so the newest cruise ships don't fit through there. So we only have smaller boats or older cruise ships that still take advantage of this canal. Here's one from the other entrance, and you can see how high the bridges are if you ever want to go there one day and bungee jump. Well, now we're going to leave the canal, or the Diol Coast, but I still want you to imagine being in that flat area, that 4-mile crossing area that Corinth controls. And we give a name to that area. It's called Isthmus. There is no city here, but there is a bunch of things happening here. And so let's fill in what's happening in this Isthmus region, because Corinth has control over these things too. So here we have the head of an athlete. How do I know that? Because the athlete is wearing a crown of pine. That's right. In the ancient world, right, you didn't win a physical crown, you won a victory wreath. And the wreath was made up of different materials. And the reason I'm showing this is because one of the 4 Pan-Hellenic games, you know about the Olympic Games, of course, that's on the other far side of the Peloponnesus, but there are 3 other big Greek games that people came from around the world. They had a lot of prestige. One was in Delphi called the Pythian Games, named after the python snake that Apollo conquered, and part of the Pythian, the Pythonesses, the the priestesses of Apollo who served him over there. And then there was Nemea. Nemea is located quite close to Corinth, the Nemean Games. But the fourth one is called the Isthmian Games. We might better call them the Corinthian Games because, as I said, there is no city named Isthmus, and Corinth is controlling these games, but they have the name of the region called the Isthmian Games. And they're held, not like the Olympics every 4 years, they're held every 2 years. And that's of interest because that means there's a great chance that Paul's stay, his 1.5 year stay, overlapped with the hosting of the Isthmian Games. And maybe it's not surprising that Paul's first and longest use of the sports metaphor is found in his Corinthian correspondence. In 1 Corinthians 9, he has a nice analogy about, don't you know that all runners compete, but they don't all win the race? And he talks about the race that he's in and how he's competed. And they do it to win a prize. He says they win a perishable prize because obviously a wreath made of various natural materials is not going to last very long. But Paul says we compete to receive an imperishable crown, or better translated, an imperishable wreath. And so that whole sports metaphor makes good sense, well, to anyone in the ancient world because they're familiar with games, but especially to the Corinthians who are hosting every other year the Isthmian Games. Here's a class in the past who decided to make for me a crown or a wreath of celery because that was also one of the ones that was celebrated, and I'm dutifully wearing my victory wreath. Here's a nice stele. It's kind of like a pillar with an image on it. And you can see there the wreaths. Look how many of them, the victory wreaths. These are two sons who, in memorial of their father, who won not athletic competitions, but music competitions, set up this stele, this monument. Here is a nice monument. And notice all the wreaths on here. This comes actually from Ephesus, because this is dedicated to like the Michael Jordan of Ephesus. They have somebody local who's competed in all kinds of games, and you can see he won many of them. And so here is the memorial. And what's of interest to me, you can't probably make it out from this picture, but from the original, and when I was there, it says right in there, the Isthmian, because this person also went to the Isthmian Games and won it, and indeed more than once. So they have the name of the place, and then they would add A or B or C or gamma, it would be in Greek, right, to indicate the multiple times that they were victorious at these different games. Here's an inscription in Latin, and that's a good reminder that we said, wait a minute, Corinth, it comes from Corinth, this inscription. Remember, Corinth has these two histories. This earlier history when it was a Greek city called Wealthy Corinth, and then it was rebuilt as a Roman city. And so it's not surprising that a lot of Latin inscriptions were found in Corinth. There are also Greek inscriptions because Greek continues to be kind of the lingua franca of the broader world, but we have a higher percentage here in Greece of Latin inscriptions because Corinth is rebuilt then as a Roman city. And this is an inscription honoring the person who paid for one of the celebrations of the Isthmian Games, right? Because these games weren't supported by taxes, so a wealthy donor would have to cough up some expenses to host these games, and then that person wants to make sure that everybody remembers how magnanimous and generous they were, and so you have an inscription commemorating that fact. Now, I said to you there wasn't a city in Isthmia, but there were some structures. So we have the games. We also have a temple here in Isthmia. This is a temple devoted to Poseidon. You can see the nice reconstruction of the impressive temple that was located here, and the stoas, the colonnade, the pillars, right, all around it in the courtyard. And here's a reconstruction of the image of the god. And the god is naked, right, because the gods were depicted always that way, and his consort beside him. I just stress that because when the Romans came along, and then in coins or in monuments, they portrayed Roman generals as naked. That was scandalous. Not because the Roman general was naked, no. The scandalous part was, the implication was, by presenting him as nude, you were presenting them as not human, but as God or God-like. Here is a nice reconstruction of the running race that took place at the Isthmian Games. So you'll see in another slide the kind of starter pit that was discovered, and also the strings that were used. So you have the starter, you have the poles, and the sticks were across in order to make sure you have a fair start. So you can envision all the sticks lined up across. The people are naked, and you say, of course they were, because gymnasiums is a place you run around and you train gymnos naked, right? And so there was usually netting around their genitalia, but other than that, they ran naked. And so the starter, in order to ensure a fair start, has the stick. They all line up in the starter blocks, and then he kind of lets the strings go, the sticks fall, and you hopefully have a fair start. Here you can see the actual grooves in the rock that are remaining from that starter system. And here's a bigger reconstruction to show how that would have looked originally, the number of people running and the starter pit and so forth. Here is a mosaic from Corinth. Why am I showing that? Because this shows a potential link between the city of Corinth and the Pythian Games, held just a couple of miles in that plain next door. You can't tell it from this picture, but you have here a goddess, either Nike or the goddess Tuke. Nike is the goddess of victory, hence the Nike sports equipment and so forth. Or Tuke is the goddess of luck. And in the mosaic, an athlete is presenting a sacrifice to the goddess. They're both female deities, depending which one is really there. And what this looks like is you have a wealthy person in Corinth who says to the artist, okay, I want something that reflects our life here in Corinth. Oh yeah, we're connected in Corinth to the Pythian Games, and so I want a scene, or maybe he was a participant in those games, I don't know, but we want a scene connected with the games. And so you have an athlete then honoring the goddess Nike, the goddess of victory, who either gave this athlete victory, or the goddess of luck, right, who bestowed good luck on the athletes such that they were victorious. And so this is a nice link between the city of Corinth and the Pythian Games. Here's a bust of Nero, and I have that here because Nero is toward the end of his life, just before things went really bad for him and he ended up committing suicide. He went to a bunch of the games, including the Pythian Games, and guess what? He won every event he entered in. Surprise, surprise. And you can see there he won 1,808 prizes. He was rather proud of himself, and these aren't only athletic events. These are, again, musical talents and acting talents, and I don't know if you know the famous closing words of Nero. He was still thinking high of himself. He said something like, oh, the world is losing a great artist. That was his final words as he had to commit suicide before the others would have killed him instead. Anyway, so he participated in the Pythian Games, and so there's an interesting link between Nero and the Pythian Games. And Nero, of course, is the emperor before whom Paul ultimately would later on appear. Well, let's leave the Pythian region. I hope we're building a picture, an image of this place for you, so that when you read the Corinthian letters, it isn't just some vague, esoteric place, but it's one that's coming alive. It would be great to go there, of course, and maybe you can join me in one of my study tours, and the images will even be more vividly impressed in your minds. But even with these pictures and with my explanation, hopefully we're envisioning a real place, right? And thereby putting his letters, that is Paul's letters to the Corinthians, in a specific historical context. So let's leave the Pythian region and move to the city itself. And I'm just going to pull back here so you can see on the screen. What you have here is the Acro Corinth, that is that high rock that we saw in those earlier pictures. And the city walls are established all around that at the base. They're not on the one side because they're so sheer, the cliffs on the one side, that they're impenetrable and there was no need to build a wall. And so the topography slopes down toward the sea, and you have a 6-mile or 10-kilometer wall going all around. So you can see it was a large city. Corinth has anywhere from a low of 60 to a high of about 100,000 people. So it ranks up there among the top 10 cities of the ancient world. And we're going to look at some things here. I think we're going to go to the Acro Corinth for a little bit. First, we'll say some comments about the Acro Corinth. And then after that, we're going to sort of say go down, and we'll head to this downtown area, the Agora, or in Roman times called the Forum. Somebody who suffers from agoraphobia, somebody who's afraid of open places, right? Because the Agora is a big open square around which commerce in the city and other official buildings were located. So we're going to start off in the Acro Corinth, and then we'll move to the city and we'll hopefully again get further understanding of this place called Corinth. So here we are. You can see the Aqua Corinth in the distance. Again, very prominent. You see it for miles and miles away. And you see now right away, look at the paved marble road. You've got sidewalks with drainage on there and everything. This is on the road to the nearest harbor, the one in the west, Lycaeum. Here's a close-up of the road, the sidewalk, and the gutter system. And you say, well, I'm surprised. Or maybe you shouldn't be, because it is a top 10 city of the ancient world. Don't sell the ancients short in terms of their standard of living and their ability to build and construct things. Here it is from a distance, from the edge of the sea. It's a little wide angle, so it's not as far actually as it looks in this picture. And now we're on the way up. I think I took this picture driving up the Acro Corinth. You can see the remains of the Byzantine walls, but are built on top of the ancient walls, dating back to before Paul's time. And here's the same picture we saw earlier. Here we are on top of the Acro Corinth. We're breathing heavy, right, because it takes a while. It's 2,000 feet above sea level, and it's a pretty steep climb. But here we are, and we went to the very corner of it, and we have this panoramic view of the isthmus area. So below we see the two seas. We're imagining the Diol Coast, the ships and the goods being hauled back and forth. We're imagining the Pythian Games being held here, and the temple to Poseidon, all happening here in the valley below. If we turn just a little bit to the west, so it's kind of like northwest, at the bottom of the hill, you can see there the remains from the ancient city of Corinth. If you look straight ahead in the distance, so you can see obviously some newer city, and that's what I told you earlier, where in the, I think it was the late 1800s or mid 1800s, there was a rather significant earthquake, and so then the city rebuilt itself now by the edge of the sea. And so you can see the modern Corinth in the distance around that bay closest where the canal now is. And so we're more interested, because that's where the ancient city is, here over to the left, right at the base of the Acro Corinth. You can see how close the sea is. You can see mainland. That's mainland Greece, right across the bay. It's that close. Here we are looking more down. You can see those hills in the distance are mainland Greece, not the Peloponnesus. So the water is the bay of, or the Gulf of Corinth. At the very bottom, you can see just a few ruins. Maybe in the center you see there a temple. We'll look at that in a bit. And that's the downtown area, or what's left of the downtown area of ancient Corinth. Here's some more close-ups. Now, we know that there was a temple actually on top of the Acro Corinth. The Acro Corinth is quite large compared to, say, the Acropolis in Athens. So the Acropolis is famous in Athens. In fact, that's why it's called the Acropolis. But Acropolis just means a high city. So lots of ancient cities have a high city, have an Acropolis. But Corinth is also quite famous, and so it's called the Acro Corinth, right? So it's the high part of Corinth, and it had lots of structures up there, but one famous structure was the Temple of Aphrodite, the Temple of Aphrodite. We know that from the literary sources, and we even know what it looks like from this coin. You can see even in a small coin, they managed to have that big rock, that's the Acro Corinth, and you can see there the style of the Temple of Aphrodite on top. Here's a coin also about, there's water on top over there, and this is a myth named the horse Bellephoron, and with its hoof it kind of dug at the ground and up sprang some water. These are some of the myths that we can maybe move more quickly through. So anyway, this is a fountain on that upper part of the Acro Corinth, because you know, water is of necessity for living, and so people could retreat on here, and they had water access for a long, long time. You can see even there's a decorative part to the pool or to the fountain in the Fountain of Pyrene that has to do with another myth. So I think we're ready to go downtown, and so here we have a reconstruction of some buildings downtown. I can take just a moment with the cursor to maybe explain some things to you, right? So the cursor right there, that's the main road. It says the Lycaeum Road, because down over here is that nearest port on the west. And then along the side will be shops and businesses. We may see some of that. There's a fountain over here. There are lots of fountains, and that's important too, because water is of great, great necessity. And if you're going to have 80 or 60 or even up to 100,000 people, you need to have ample supply of water, and Corinth does. And you can see that reflected in all the fountains or the pools or the places where citizens could gather water. And one of those many multiple fountains is right there. So if you go down the city, look at the cursor, there'll be a big gate, a monument gate, under which you would enter. And then you see this big, huge rectangular area. That's the Agora. Actually, it goes like this, the Agora, the big open area. And then you're going to see some stoas. These are shops here. And let me tell you already now that from this point to this point, this south stoa is the longest stoa of any discovered yet. So it's it kind of reflects the size of Corinth. It's the longest run of shops of any downtown excavated from the ancient world. There's also the Weima in the center, the speaker's platform, and this relates to the story of Paul. We'll see that. There's some temples over here. I don't think I have pictures of those. They're just ruins left, but there are multiple. We have inscriptional or archaeological evidence for 26 temples. Right? So there are multiple gods worshipped here in this area. And you see this Julian Basilica. That's a building devoted to the Julian line, from the Julian-Claudian line, to pay their homage to Rome, because they were a Roman city and enjoyed good relationships with Rome after it was rebuilt. There's a Temple of Octavia. We'll see a picture of that. Well, here's the Archaic Temple. It's called the Temple of Apollo. We'll say something about that. We won't see this in the pictures, but you'll see a little bit. There's a huge theater and an Odium. So all the kind of buildings you'd expect in a big city are found naturally here. So shops, Agora, downtown area. You're going to see temples, multiple of ones. You're going to see a Weima, speaker's platform, in the center or close in a prominent place in the Agora. You're going to see fountains, multiples ones of those for water supply. Most cities, big cities, are going to have a theater, not to be confused with an amphitheater. That's during Roman times. You have an Odium. An Odium is like a small theater, but usually is covered and used more for musical performances and dramas. You're going to see a gymnasium, because the exercise of the body and the exercise of mind. These are all the kind of buildings that are typically found in cities of the ancient world and are also found then in Corinth too. Now when we look at the ruins, they're not also impressive, so you have to use your imagination a little bit, and that's why I took some time in that reconstruction. But here we go. So this building I'm showing first because it's the only building to survive the destruction of Corinth by the Roman general Mummius in 146. Remember those 2 lives that the city have? And the city was virtually completely leveled or razed. The Romans were trying to send a message to everyone else, and so Corinth was kind of the leading city, and so they were picked on to provide an example. That happened sometimes. Carthage was another situation, right? Because Carthage and Rome were often battling each other. And so, anyway, to send a message to all the cities who were part of that consortium of cities collected against Rome, they picked on Corinth as the biggest and the instigator, and so they leveled it. And the only building to really survive is this Apollo temple, sometimes called the Archaic Temple, because it's the only building that goes back to the older archaic period. So the Romans changed things a little bit, but that's one of the buildings to survive. It was an impressive temple. Maybe you can see that by all the original columns that existed. Those are also monolithic columns. In other words, they aren't made of drums. They're all of one piece. So it's an impressive temple with 38. Doric is the oldest style of capitals. And again, it was divided into 2 parts to worship not only Apollo, but also another god, perhaps also in honor of the emperor. Next, we're seeing there's the road, that main road to Lycaeum we were on earlier, with the sidewalks and the gutters and the paved street. That's one angle. Here's another angle. You can't quite, the road's right below. You can see shops along here. And we could imagine, with some plausibility, Paul here, because from Acts we read that Paul was here for a year and a half, and he hung out with Priscilla and Aquila, this Jewish couple from Rome. Well, if they're from Rome, what are they doing in Corinth? Well, that's because of the edict of Claudius, the Emperor Claudius. There was a controversy in Rome over a Crestus. Crestus is a misspelling of Christ. And so the Jews, Christian Jews and other Jews, were arguing, divided over this Chrestus. And so anyway, Claudius said, enough of that, let's just kick all the Jews out of Rome. And so Priscilla and Aquila were caught up in that edict, and so they had to leave Rome and they went to Corinth. And because of the Jewish connection, because they were Christians, Paul ends up connecting with them. And they were well-to-do, and they seemed to be involved in some kind of business of working with leather. And so it's not a stretch of the imagination to envision then Priscilla and Aquila and Paul. That the shop would be in the first part, and the back would be the housing area. And this is where Paul provided for himself. As he said later to the Corinthians, I preached the gospel to you for free, right? Because I provided for my own support. Actually, later on, Timothy and Silas came to Paul with money from the north, from Macedonia, and so Paul could give up his day job and concentrate on preaching. But what he said to the Corinthians was true. You guys didn't pay for my housing, you didn't pay for my food, and Paul uses this a little bit to shame the Corinthians into participating into this collection that you may know about he was making toward the end of his life. Here's a close-up of what's left of those shops right off of the main road going into the heart of downtown Corinth. Here on the other side of the road, before you actually get in the city, is one of those multiple fountains I mentioned, right? Remember there's a fountain on top of the Acro Corinth. You can see it there in the shadow in the back of the picture. Here's another fountain. The ancients thought that they were somehow connected. The water from the top went all the way down to the bottom. That's not the case. But you can see quite a large pool, originally with pillars all the way around. And actually, when you go there, still today, you can hear water. The water is below those arches. You can't go in there anymore. I could a few years ago, and I grabbed some pictures. But even when you stand outside that area today, you can hear the water running, because there's lots of natural water running underneath from the Acro Corinth toward the sea, and Corinth then can dig down and tap into that precious resource. Here's a more close-up of that fountain. And underneath you can see water-type images. So you can see here like a crayfish or another fish, which would be an appropriate kind of painting or image to have on a place associated with water. Here's another fountain, the Fountain of Glauca. There's a whole myth surrounding that. And again, I'm just showing this to give you a sense that there are multiple fountains because there are multiple places where Corinth has access to water, and that's another reason for its success. So it's strategic location, commercial activity, military activity. We've got fertile lands all the way around. We have the games, and in addition to all that, we have an ample supply of water. Here's a reconstruction of that Fountain of Glauca and how it worked. So where are we going next? Oh, here we're going. We're going to the downtown area. So if you follow the cursor, there's the huge agora area, and in the center of it is the bema, or the speaker's platform. And that's of interest to us because it doesn't look very impressive now, but it would have been overlaid with marble, and there were other structures on top of it. It was a very impressive place. And this is where the governor, the technical term is the proconsul, would often adjudicate matters. And we read in Acts that the Jews in Corinth were not happy with Paul, and they lodged a formal charge against him, and they brought him before Gallio. And so Paul may well have been right here on the bema, as this is a picture of me from a few years ago. He used to not be able to go up there, and just recently they put some platforms on top, and they're reconstructing it, and so you can walk, not on it, but at least on top of it, and you can say you were in the bema of Corinth, perhaps the place where Paul himself was tried by the governor or proconsul Gallio. And I don't know if you remember, but Gallio kind of dismissed this matter and said it was just an internal Jewish deal, and so that was good for the Christians when Paul left, so there was no official judgment against Christianity in Corinth. If you want to see, this is a great reconstruction of a stoa, right? A portico, a collection of pillars. Basically, it ends up being a covered sidewalk. And this comes from Athens. This is an actual picture. This is a reconstruction. The Rockefellers, a super rich family from the United States, paid for the reconstruction of the Stoa in Athens. And I use this picture because this is what you can imagine what three of the sides of Corinth would have had. And remember what I said, that the Stoa, or this collection of shops behind this covered area, from Corinth was the longest, longer than even this huge impressive one here in Athens. This is actually a double stoa. You can see that they've got not one pillar roof, but two. So you've got two aisles providing mostly shade from the sun. Water isn't such a problem. And then behind that would be then the shops. And so along the stoa are shops, but also some other buildings. This is the Boulaterion. Boule, the Greek word boule, is council. It's kind of in a semicircular shape, lending itself toward discussion or dialogue, and this is where the city leaders met to discuss issues. But along this were also these shops, and you can see what is left, and that round thing is of interest too, because that's a well. And so all these shops, I forget how many wells, I think it says almost all of them anyway, of the 33 shops along this long run of stoa could tap down and have access to water. This is looking at the other stoa, and you can see not much over here. Again, I told you the ruins are not so impressive, and that's why lots of non-Christians don't actually visit Corinth. They kind of skip Corinth and visit other places in the Peloponnesus. But Christians, of course, are interested in Corinth because of its connection to the Bible. And if you know the stories, and if you can look at the reconstructions, then even though the ruins themselves are not so impressive, with your imagination you have a pretty good feel for what the city of Corinth was like, the place where Paul went and spent a year and a half. Here's the reconstruction. So if I could use the cursor again over here, this is the gate. Underneath here is the road with the shops and the fountain. This is the road to the closer port. And you come underneath this monumental arch, and on top you have the quadra, where the four horses in the chariot, all in bronze. So, you would be impressed by that. Well, just today, when you come into a city, it says, "Welcome to X and X city." And some cities are pretty lame, but other cities spend a bit of money because they want the first impression of people coming in to be positive. And Corinth is kind of proud of itself, and so its main gate celebrates its wealth and its power. Right beside it is a two-story basilica, Now be careful, we hear the word basilica and we think church. Not really. It was, but not till later. A basilica is just a name given to a certain style of building. What kind of style of building? It's a building where you have outside walls, but in the center are two rows of pillars. Right? So if you put two rows of pillars, that ends up with three aisles, right? Because you've got outside wall to the first pillar. Between the two pillars is another one, and then the outside. And so this basilica refers to a certain structure of building that has basically two rows of column, with the result that there are three aisles. And at first, basilicas were used basically as administrative buildings. They're located typically right downtown, and this is where city business was held. Now later on, when Christianity became more popular, accepted, and churches were built, they followed this basilica model, and then that's why we associate the name basilica still today as a synonym for church. So here is a impressive two-story basilica, government building located right downtown. Over here, that's the archaic temple, the first picture we saw, the Temple of Apollo going way back. That's at a higher level set back from the agora. And then over here, those are the stoas again, like we saw from Athens, except this is only a single. On the south side, it was double story. On this side, it was single story. And you can see how small the people are right over here to give you some sense of the scale. And of course there are statues and other monuments because this is prime real estate. And you'd like to have your statue or monument in the heart of downtown Corinth. Actually, there were also races held here even for a little while. Here's a picture. You can see the starting block right over here. You can see see the pattern? There's a little where the foot would go there. And here's a good model where you have your back foot and your front foot in the starting block, if you will, and they'd all be lined up and waiting for the start. Oh, I guess I don't have a picture, but you can see here the reconstruction. So on this end, right over here, this is the agora. Again, there's the Weima, there's the long stoa with the boule, and the shops with the wells. Over here is the, whoops, let's go the other direction. Sorry about that. Oh, wrong way. Go up again. There we go. Over here, that's the basilica. Over here, here's the North Stoa. Then over here, there were about 3 or 4 temples. Right over here, 3 or 4 temples. You can see that in the drawings up here. Look at there's the reconstructions. But in a minute, we're going to go up, I think, over here to this baby. This is the Temple of Octavia. So there it is. You can see the raised platform, and obviously the pillars were way higher. You can see the Corinthian capitals, because this is built from the Roman period, the time where Paul was there. And that's my wife from a few years ago, this there for scale. And so you can see what a mammoth temple it was. And it likely was in honor of Octavia. Who is she? She's the sister of Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus. Caesar made Octavia, his sister, marry Mark Antony. That was for political reasons. And then Mark Antony kind of abandoned her and shacked up with Cleopatra, as you know. But Octavia spent time in Athens and in this part of Greece, and so she was honored there, and this is a temple in honor of her. And so we should think of the Imperial Cult, right? The worship of Rome as an empire, sometimes personified as a woman, Roma, or often the temple set in honor of individual emperors, or in this case, highly unusual, but in this case, an emperor's sister. Here is the god Asclepius. How do I know that? Because, well, you can tell right away. He walks everywhere with that staff, and around the staff is the snake, the serpent, because he's the god of healing. And still today, the American Medical Association has that idea of the serpent around a pole or something. So Asclepius, why are we looking at him? Because there was an Asclepius temple located on the edge of the city wall, just inside the city walls on the edge of the city. And this comes from Athens, the actual statue, and that's obviously me showing you a bit about its size or scale. This one isn't so large. But if you look on the map, this Asclepius temple is located right there, just inside the city wall, just on the edge of the main road going not too far from the main road to Lycaeum. So this Asclepius temple is of some interest to us for a variety of reasons. You can see, by the way, these are just the base that's left. Again, not very impressive. It's not easy to get here, and so you don't get many tourists. See these pits? This is where the snakes, remember snakes associated with Asclepius, would have been held. And the structure is like this. There's your temple proper. So the statue of Asclepius, right, a nude statue, implying his divinity, would have been housed inside the temple. Obviously, in front of the temple, there has to be an altar, because you've got to have a place to sacrifice things to whoever the god is, in this case, Asclepius. And then you can see the pits, this side and that side, would have been where the snakes were held, right? But look at the other structures over here. The abaton in the back is the sleeping area. Why? Because it was believed you would go to spend the night in the sleeping area behind the temple, and Asclepius would come to you in a dream, and he might heal you directly, or he might whisper to you or tell you what you should do, what instructions you should follow in order to be healed. But what I'm especially interested in with regard to Corinth is below here. So this is the side angle, the temple, the altar. There's the abaton. Below the abaton, maybe you can't make it out, it says dining rooms. Dining rooms. From the top down, there we go. 1, 2, 3 dining rooms. Because you see, in the ancient world, when you offered especially meat to a pagan god, you wouldn't burn up that meat completely. That would be complete waste. Only a small portion of the meat is actually sacrificed. So you have all this huge leftover meat. What happens to the leftover meat? One of two things. Either it's sold in the marketplace, in the agora, right? You can assume that most of the meat hadn't been cooked yet, right? It had been offered to a pagan god, and now it was being sold, right? The priest would use it to pay for his salary or upkeeps for the temple. So you could assume that most of the meat sold in the marketplace had been previously offered to a pagan god. Or you would take some of that meat and you would take it to a dining room and eat it. In this case, a dining room located right in the temple, and you would eat it there. And this was a huge issue in the early church. In fact, it was a huge issue in Corinth, so much so that Paul took 1, 2, 3 whole chapters, 1 Corinthians 8, 1 Corinthians 9, 1 Corinthians 10, even one verse from 11. All of it deals with meat sacrificed to idols, whether it was okay for Christians to go to a temple like this, and even if they didn't offer anything, but to have a meal there. And you can see some other pictures about those dining rooms. There's some other details about the temple that you might want to read and find interesting. You can see the ruins aren't, again, so impressive, but here's the walkway down to that area. And this picture is good because you can make out one of the dining rooms, and you can see here the seats, the base of the seats, right, where people would recline, because this exactly is actually found in 1 Corinthians 8:10. Paul says, if somebody sees you literally reclining in an idol's temple. Most Bibles won't translate it that way because they're afraid you don't know what reclining means. And they'll translate it for if somebody sees you eating in an idol's temple or a pagan's temple. But it says reclining because in the ancient world you didn't sit at a table, you recline. And so you have couches on the outside. In front would be tables, wood tables. They're all gone. These couches obviously had cushions and things like that are gone. And in the center is a little fire pit where the meat or food could be cooked. I think I have here a reconstruction about how this might go. And Corinthian Christians did this all their life before they became followers of Jesus, and they wanted to keep on doing it after they became followers of Jesus. And Paul says, we haven't got time to talk about it in detail here, but the quick answer, he says no, because he says when you go to a building which is devoted to a pagan god, and you have dinner there, that ain't a regular dinner anymore. That's not just a place to eat. No, he uses the word koinonia. You have a level of fellowship with this pagan god. You have a level of intimacy with this pagan god that makes you guilty of something, namely idolatry. And that's why Paul vehemently says Christians are not to participate in this very common practice. Actually, the apostolic decree, the first synod in Jerusalem, warned against the same thing. And in the 7 letters to the 7 churches, 2 of the churches, Pergamum and Thyatira, are also accused of eating meat sacrificed to idols. Exactly the same thing. Going to a pagan temple or another building devoted to a pagan god and having a meal. Not a regular meal. It has a religious connotation. It becomes then a cultic meal. And as a result, those who participate in those meals are guilty of idolatry. All that comes alive easily from looking at this one temple. But there are more examples. This is kind of fascinating. They found here in Corinth body parts, terracotta replicas of body parts at the Asclepius Temple. Because this is actually a cross-cultural phenomenon still today. The idea is you'd take the diseased part to the god or goddess, and then you'd leave it behind because you'd go home healed. And the consistency of these body parts suggests that there would have been like a workshop close by. You can't carry a leg or an arm or a head or whatever their body part, that you were having problems with from far away. And so you'd come to Corinth, you'd buy the body part that represents the disease you have, and then you'd offer it up as a sacrifice to Asclepius. You'd leave it at the temple and you'd go home healed, hopefully, right? And so we found these body parts there, and that's kind of fascinating. I have a bunch of them saved in this room. I don't want this to go on too long, but there are some interesting sayings here. These sayings come from another Asclepius temple, but they give us a window into the kind of things that surely happen at the Asclepius Temple in Corinth too. And so here's a person who had a problem with headaches, and this is a person who was balding, and we can see breast from the idea of fertility, women who weren't becoming pregnant. Also, you see male genitalia, again, having to do probably with fertility issues. And these are all people who went to the Temple of Asclepius in order to have their body part healed or to become more fertile or things like that. Here's a person with eye problems. This comes from another city, just to show you that it's not just Corinth. This comes from Pergamum. It's over in Turkey. This is one of the 7 letters to the 7 churches of Revelation. And here's a person who is either had an ear problem, or the ear could actually just represent whatever it is that this person said to Asclepius. They heard it. So the ear represents the fact that the god heard. And the inscription is quite interesting. Even if you're not a Greek geek, you can see Asclepio right over there, Asclepio for Asclepius, the god Asclepius. And then the next word, there's a little dot here breaking it, is Soter, soteros, right, over there. Because you have the word soter, which is the word Savior. It's not a common term used for Jesus, but he's called Savior, except now it's not Jesus who's called Soter, it's Asclepius. And this is a person who addresses, it's a woman who is thankful to Asclepius for hearing their plea, their cry for health, and they offer this as a thank offering. Here's something else that connects to Corinth. You can see here, this is the so-called synagogue inscription. So the Greek words synagoge, so the first part of the word is missing because it's rough here, but you see G-O-G-E, synagoge, and then there's no H sound in Greek, that's a rough breathing, so then after H you have E-B-R, right? The synagogue of the Hebrews, the synagogue of the Hebrews. And we also found in Corinth this menorah, and you don't find a menorah unless there's some Jews around. And this is of interest to us because, as we said, from Acts 18, Paul comes roaring into town, the beginning of that year and a half, 18-month ministry in Corinth. And where does he go? He goes, first of all, to the synagogue. And so these archaeological artifacts remind us of that aspect of the story, the gospel coming to Corinth. Here is the theater. Right, there's not much left, but it was quite a large theater, and some significant events were held here. You can see a little bit of what's left of the seats, and then this would have been the kind of orchestra area, and they just call it that. It's not an actual orchestra. And then you have the stage, and then behind it would have been buildings, and different scenes would show up. And it can seat 15,000. I don't know if that sounds impressive to you. It should be. It's a pretty large theater, and lots of big events were held here. In fact, they even were skilled enough to flood the main stage and hold mock sea battles. And so, again, don't think that these productions were cheap or lame. There were some pretty impressive productions, although entirely fitting for a top 10 city in the ancient world. Here is the Odium. By the way, both the Odium and the theater are taking advantage of the slope. Remember, from the Acro Corinth up high, sloping down to the sea. And so, going back into Greek times, they could carve into the bedrock, and that's why these seats have survived for such a long period of time, because they're part of the bedrock, and even with all the erosion and exposure, the at least basic structure of it is still visible. So, the Odium is a smaller place. Those of us from Canada know that Odium is a word used for theaters in Canada, movie theaters, for instance. And that goes back then to the ancient world for these smaller venues, often with a covered roof, in distinction from the big theaters where the bigger shows and later on the gladiator events and other things were held. This is the fairly famous Erastus inscription. Erastus inscription. You can see here in Latin, E-R-A-S-T-U-S, Erastus. And it's famous for Christians because there is an Erastus mentioned in the New Testament, and this inscription says Erastus, who has this particular office, this kind of position in the city structure, paid for the pavement. Remember, there's no taxes, and so wealthy people pay for civic projects, and then they want their good deed to be remembered, and so inscriptions do that. And anyway, in the Bible we have a mention of Erastus, and it's not a common name, and he's also given a city title. He's called the city treasurer. It's not exactly the same title as this one, and so that's led to the possibility that the actual Erastus of the Bible might be this guy right here, because when Paul wrote to the Romans, and he gives greetings from different people, he mentions Erastus. And Paul wrote Romans from Corinth or from the port city of Corinth, Kenkrea. And so, again, the whole big question is this the same Erastus as the guy mentioned in the New Testament? If it were, it'd be cool and nice. If it isn't, it's not a big deal. But a bit of debate ink is spilled on that question. I just want you to be aware that there are other temples. I mentioned like 26 different temples. So there's a temple to Demeter. Demeter is a female goddess of land, fertility, of crops and things like that. Kore is the word for a young girl because the daughter of Demeter, her name is Persephone. And so you see the two of them there, right? Demeter and her daughter Persephone. And that's important because there was a large Demeter temple. Okay, there's the Aqua Corinth. There's the downtown. There's the Asclepius where we were. But right between the downtown and this area, on the slopes, was a rather large area devoted to the worship of Demeter. And I don't know if you get any sense of the scale from these pictures. I didn't take these pictures because what happened is the archaeologists backfilled in order to protect the site a little bit. But you can see from the steps going up that this was a large area. What I want you to notice at this time is this, is that 40 dining rooms from different periods have been discovered. And then I actually sat with the archaeologist a couple of years ago, Nancy Bukidis. There was a huge rainstorm a couple of summers ago, and it exposed more dining rooms. And so she estimates that as many as 100 or more dining rooms from the Temple of Demeter are located over here. And you don't build 100 dining rooms unless what? Unless a lot of people are dining. And so it again reminds us of how widespread and popular this practice was of eating meat sacrificed to idols. And it explains why the Corinthians, Christians, they've done this all their life before they became believers, before they became followers of Jesus, and they were tempted to keep on doing it even after they became followers of Christ. And so here are some more dining rooms which shed light on that 3-chapter discussion, 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. I showed this for 2 reasons. One, because this is a mirror made of Corinthian bronze. The Corinth apparently was able to produce a certain patina, a certain kind of bronze that people were crazy about in the ancient world. And there's lots of evidence that they were kind of like collector's items. They were very, very valuable, sometimes even more valuable than gold. And so here we have yet another reason why Corinth is known and wealthy and powerful in the ancient world. And also because of the fact that this is a mirror, and it reminds me of a text from 1 Corinthians, and I know that you know the text. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13:12, "Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then in the future we will see face to face. Now I know in part. Then it should say, I will know fully, even as I am fully known." So what Paul says is, now I don't see things quite clearly. I see things only as in a mirror. Now, if you think only of mirrors today, that doesn't make sense, because when I look in a mirror, it perfectly, one for one, well, it reverses it, but it perfectly images who I am. I mean, it shows my receding hairline, it shows my glasses, my goofy grin, my eyebrows that are dang. So mirrors tell me exactly who I am. But in the ancient world, they weren't made of glass, they were made of polished metal. And so you get a reflection, but it wasn't exact. It was a little bit cloudy or fuzzy. And Paul says that's the way it is for us now. Now in the present time, we don't see things sharply and clearly, and that will change when Jesus comes. Then we will know perfectly well. And so this analogy, this metaphor that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians 13 makes sense if you understand mirrors in the ancient world. And the fact that it's made of bronze, again, just reminds us of another unique feature of ancient Corinth. Here's a floor mosaic, and there are others of them that have been discovered that are found in the museum there. I just picked this one because I wanted to remind you that there is no Corinthian church building. I know that you probably know that already, but we have to think of house churches and how important it is for Paul to find a wealthy person who will allow their home to be used. And in Corinth, it could be Priscilla and Aquila. It actually looks a little bit better like a guy named Gaius. And I say that because when Paul writes to the Romans, again from Corinth, he says, "Gaius, who is host to me and the whole church, greet you." So Gaius looks like a patron of Paul, a wealthy person who probably is a believer, allows Paul to live in their home, and also allows the Christian church to meet in his home, because most people don't have homes. And so this is a floor mosaic from a wealthy person like Gaius, and so we have to think of a house congregation. That has implications too for as we think about different problems or issues in the Corinthian church. We're almost done. A couple of comments about the other port. Remember, there are 2 ports of Corinth. We have the nearby one, Lechaeum, only about a mile or so away. But then you have Kenkrea. So Lechaeum is to the west, Kenkrea is to the east. And you can see on this picture, because it's partly global warming, but it's also the whole Peloponnesus is tilting a little bit. So actually it's sinking the land. And so as a result, the moles, what's a mole? That's actually these breakwaters. You see the brown over here? They're now underwater, but you can still see them in this reconstruction. And if you had a helicopter, I didn't, but you could take it from on top. You can still see it in this picture too. So from up high, you can see underneath in the water. See the cursor here? You can still see the remnants of the ancient harbor of Kenkrea. And when you look at this, when you go there, there's nothing there, and it's hard to believe that this is one of the busiest ports of the ancient world. All kinds of traffic is pumping through this particular place. And there are temples located here. Again, this is not really a city, although it's of good size, and so there are other structures associated with it. But I want you to know there are two biblical connections to Kenkrea that are kind of interest. I'm just going through. All right, here I am on one of my trips pontificating about those biblical connections. One has to, this is where Paul got a haircut. Maybe you remember on the third missionary journey that Paul cut his hair here at Kenkrea. And you might wonder what that's all about. And you have to go to the Old Testament, this Nazirite vow that involved the not cutting of hair except at the end of the vow. And you might want to check into that a bit more and why Paul, if he was an apostle to Gentiles, is still doing this very Jewish thing. Although he says in 1 Corinthians 9, right? I've become all things to all people. To those under the law, I became as one under the law. Anyway, Kenkrea, this is where Paul got a haircut on his way to Jerusalem on the end of the third missionary journey. And the other interesting connection with Kenkrea is Romans 16. There's a woman that Paul commends. Her name is Phoebe. She likely is, at bare minimum, the letter carrier of Romans. There is no mail delivery service. Letters have to be carried by hand. And so Phoebe is somebody from Kenkrea. She's called a diakonos, either a servant or a deacon or some other official from the church of Kenkrea. So there's a church not only in Corinth, there's a church in Kenkrea. And Phoebe is from that church, and she's carrying the letter of Paul to the Romans. Well, friends, this was maybe a little long presentation. Maybe you took a break in between, but I hope that you did find it helpful in making Corinth come to life. That it's not just a name, a vague place floating around out there in Never Never Land, but now you have an image. So when you read the letter to Corinthians, you say, oh yeah, I can picture that. Its strategic location, you know, the entrance to the Peloponnesus, its two ports. You can imagine the Acro Corinth. You can think of the Agora and all of the characteristics that go into this top 10 city of the ancient world named Corinth. Thanks for your attention.